Okay, let's go ahead and move on to Chapter 8. And in Chapter 8, we're going to talk about how important it is for um, any finding to be supported by multiple studies using multiple different techniques. It's what we call the principle of converging evidence. Okay, so let's begin first with a philosophical concept called connectivity. Connectivity tells us that new explanations must be connected to previous explanations. This is a really critical concept for students to understand from the very beginning of their scientific careers, because it's really important that any study that you do be connected to previous studies, ideally being just one step beyond what the previous studies have done. A lot of times we dream of being, trying to think of a good example of a real person. I'll say Einstein, because Einstein's known for having basically changed the way that we all understand the way that the world works. But the truth is his theories were incrementally growing from previous findings also. We all like to think that we're going to be the person who just makes a huge discovery, and that the only way to make a huge discovery is to go off in our own area, something that's never really been studied before, and really come up with something novel. But that's not really how good science is conducted. Good science is conducted in a little incremental, step-by-step process where every new explanation is tied to the previous explanations and is tied to the previous known data. So when we talk about connectivity, what we're saying is that new explanations, new accounting for how the world works or how behavior manifests itself, things like that, new explanations must explain not only that data that was previously inexplicable. You know, there's always something that a theory or a hypothesis doesn't do a good job of accounting for. And so there's always some shortcoming in a theory. So a new theory may come along and it can explain the things that weren't explained before. But it's only a useful theory if it can not only explain the previously inexplicable, but also explain that which has been accounted for by the previous theory, so that we're actually growing the field. We're not fragmenting it and saying, well, I can explain this part of the phenomenon and you can explain that part of the phenomenon, but we don't have one cohesive explanation for the full range of things that are occurring in the phenomenon. I have a video I like to show in class, and if you Google Scientific American Frontiers and find the episode called Talkin' Babies, you can see what I'm talking about. In this video it shows, actually it's not called Talkin' Babies, I apologize, this has a typo on it. I'm going to fix it right now, in fact, as we're talking. It is actually a segment called Born to Talk. So you want to go to Scientific American Frontiers, and it's called Born to Talk. And it's available on pbs.org. And in this video they have Steven Pinker, who's a well-known researcher in the field of language, demonstrating how we know that children apply grammar rules on the fly while they're talking. They don't just have things memorized and stored in their brains. So it's a good video for illustrating what I wanted to talk about next, which is just an effort to try and make this concept of connectivity kind of concrete. It's about a 6-minute video, so if you can Google it and watch it, it's a pretty good one. But let me tell you what basically Pinker is trying to talk about. In the field of language acquisition, up until about 1958, people were pretty well accepting Skinner's interpretation that language is acquired by children through a series of reinforcements and punishments that we get from the environment for correctly using language or for failing to use language. So for Skinner, it would be something like, okay, so I see the cookie on the counter, and I want a cookie, right? Of course, Skinner does not say anything about you wanting it. All Skinner will talk about is there's a cookie, and then the little toddler says the word cookie as his response, and then he gets a cookie, and that's the reinforcement. And so the fact that he gets a cookie when he says the word cookie makes it more likely that in the future he'll say cookie again. So for Skinner, it was purely a reinforcement strategy. When I get reinforced, it makes me want to do the response that led to that response. When I get reinforced, it makes me want to repeat the response that led to that reinforcement. All right, well, that's pretty simple, and it accounts for a lot of language learning. I mean, absolutely, the words that we learn are probably acquired largely through reinforcement. But one of the things that Skinner had trouble with was the universal errors, like when you see children pluralizing incorrectly. Shoes is already plural, right? But you'll hear kids say shoeses. There are certain verbs that don't follow the normal rules for conjugation, like go doesn't follow the normal rule where you just put ed on the end of a word. And so you'll hear kids say things like we goed to the store or we wented to the store. Or like superlatives. Normally you put an est on the end of a word if you want to say that it's the superlative. But words like best and most don't need the est on the end, yet you'll hear kids tacking the est onto the end. Now I'm using English because this should be the language that we're all sharing, right? But any of you who speak another language know that there are irregular words in every language. My second language that I can speak is Spanish, and one of the things that is hard when you're learning a second language, or maybe even your first language, is to get these irregular words memorized so that you don't make these mistakes, right? So in Spanish, I've been known to basically use baby talk. When I try to say that I know something, I oftentimes misconjugate the verb for to know. Anybody who speaks Spanish knows what I'm talking about. Every language has irregulars that you just have to memorize, basically. But the fact that kids at roughly the same age worldwide make these errors makes Skinner's theory kind of questionable, because he tried to account for these errors. He said, well, maybe these kids have been reinforced somehow for generating these incorrect forms. But then when he's pressed and he's asked, well, where do they come up with these incorrect forms in the first place? He says, well, they must have done it by accident at first and then got reinforced, something like that. He had a lot of trouble, in other words, trying to explain why this happened. So along came a guy named Chomsky, and in 1969-1970 he introduced the idea that maybe we all carry around inside of our heads a universal grammar system that allows us to figure out the rules of whatever language we're exposed to when we're little babies. So he said that the child, through their universal grammar system, is just sort of accidentally picking up that if you want to say something that happened in the past in English, you throw an ed on the end. If you want to pluralize something, you throw an s on the end. If you want to say that it's the superlative, you add an est. Sorry, that's my dog. Oh no, now the other dog barks, so now this one's barking harder. Sorry, I apologize. The thing that's nice about Chomsky's theory is that he's able to not only account for how language is acquired in general, but also how these universal errors appear, so that he can argue that it is easier and quicker to apply a rule on the fly once your vocabulary gets to a certain size. Turns out researchers have shown that it's about 1,000 words of vocabulary, and then the child will start to make these kinds of errors. So the idea that it's just quicker to apply the rule is a better explanation of the universal errors than the idea that somehow kids are being reinforced for the incorrect forms. I have a question with the reinforcement part anyway, because I know, for example, when my kids would mispronounce things, we thought they were adorable, so let's face it, we would either laugh or we would start to repeat the words ourselves. Like my son used the word colloculate when he was little and couldn't pronounce it. Instead of chocolate, he called it colloculate. What was really interesting is that as we picked up colloculate and added it to our vocabularies, he strived to delete it. He did not want, he could tell that we were saying it wrong. And so he was trying to say it the correct way so we would stop saying it wrong. So it's almost like Skinner's assumption that parents are inadvertently reinforcing might actually be not only wrong, but like backwards of how kids acquire language. Like the more parents encourage incorrect forms, the faster the kid seems to shed the wrong forms. Chomsky did a huge thing. He accounted for what we already knew. He gave us this universal grammar that would explain how kids gain access to their first language. But then he connected that explanation to one more thing, which is a good explanation for universal errors. That's a hallmark of good science. When you take the new information, you take the new explanation and tie it to the old information that had been explained before, as well as new information that had been unexplained before. Okay, let's go ahead and take a little break and we'll come back and talk about paradigms.